there is a difference between what you did and what you are, and shame collapses it. Guilt keeps the self intact. Shame puts the self on trial. The distinction between shame and guilt that has anchored psychological research in this field since the 1980s is not primarily philosophical. It is empirical, measurable, and carries significant consequences for mental health. Psychologist June Price Tangney and colleagues established it through decades of research and the development of the test of self-conscious affect. In guilt, the focus of negative evaluation is on a specific behavior: I did something wrong. In shame, the focus is on the entire self: I am wrong. The action and the actor are collapsed into the same verdict. The behavior cannot be isolated, examined, and corrected, because the behavior is now evidence of a character, and the character is what is being condemned. This is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of target. Research across functional neuroimaging, physiological measurement, and behavioral study has established that this distinction is not merely conceptual. Shame and guilt produce measurably different patterns of neural activation, different physiological signatures, different action tendencies, and different long-term consequences for both psychological well-being and social behavior. When researchers image the brains of people experiencing shame versus guilt, or measure their cortisol responses, or track their behavioral choices in the aftermath, the two emotions diverge in systematic and consistent ways. The difference in the label is a difference in the underlying biological event. They are not the same emotion with different names. June Tangney's longitudinal research tracking shame-prone and guilt-prone individuals over extended periods found consistent and striking divergence in life outcomes. Guilt-prone individuals, those inclined to evaluate specific behaviors negatively and feel responsible for making amends, showed better mental health outcomes, stronger empathy, lower rates of aggression, and higher rates of prosocial behavior across time. Shame-prone individuals showed significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, interpersonal difficulty, and in some populations, higher rates of aggression and antisocial behavior. Two emotions that feel superficially similar, both arising in response to moral transgression, both involving self-directed discomfort, produce measurably different lives when one becomes the dominant register in which the self evaluates itself. If this speaks to something in you, like and subscribe. The difference lives in what each emotion reaches for. When guilt arises, a specific action is isolated, evaluated negatively, and presented to conscious attention as something requiring repair. The rest of the self remains at a neutral distance from the transgression, troubled by it, responsible for it, but not reducible to it. There is conceptual space between what I did and who I am, and it is precisely that space in which remorse, reparative intention, and behavioral change can occur. When shame arises, there is no such space. The action is read not as a specific event with specific causes, but as evidence of something permanently, constitutively wrong with the person who performed it. The transgression becomes a verdict about identity. The verdict lands on the whole self and does not leave. The philosopher Bernard Williams described shame as producing a wish to sink into the ground, a desire not to repair but to disappear. Research on the phenomenology of shame has found this consistently. The characteristic action tendency of shame is concealment and withdrawal from others, not approach and reparation toward them. The person experiencing shame does not primarily want to fix what they did. They want to no longer be visible as the person who did it, and ideally, no longer to exist as that person at all. This is not a goal that can be accomplished through any available action. The impossibility of the goal, combined with the intensity of the wish, is one of the most reliable sources of shame's particular torment. Guilt, by contrast, produces action tendencies oriented toward repair that are specific and achievable. Research has found that guilt motivates apology, attempts to undo or compensate for harm, behavioral change, and sustained attention to the impact of the transgression on the people affected by it. The discomfort of guilt has a resolution built into its structure. Do something about what was done. The guilt experience contains its own directive toward action. The direction is outward, toward the person who was harmed. Shame's direction is inward and downward, toward concealment and away from the very connection that would allow the harm to be addressed. Shame carries a distinctive physical signature that is consistent across cultures, observable in young children, and immediately recognizable to outside observers. The head drops forward and downward, the gaze averts, the shoulders round inward, the body makes itself smaller. Research examining shame display across cultures has found this postural pattern to be among the most universally recognized and produced of any emotional expression. Identified reliably in populations across countries with no shared cultural exposure. The body does not express shame through the face alone. It expresses it through the full architecture of posture, collapsing the physical self toward the ground in a display that communicates, without words, that this person is not a threat, not proud, not occupying their full space in the world. Have you ever felt something that went deeper than guilt? Less like, I made a mistake, and more like, I am the mistake? Shame consistently involves social evaluation, but it does not require an actual audience. Research has found that people experience shame even in complete privacy, alone, with no observer present, because the evaluating perspective has been internalized. The social group standards, the imagined reactions of significant others, the anticipated judgment of the broader community. These are carried inside the person as a representation that activates when behavior falls below the standards it monitors. Shame is fundamentally a social emotion evolved in and for the context of social group membership, but it has learned to operate entirely without the social setting, running the evaluation and producing the response without any external input from the people whose judgment it is modeling. Neuroimaging research on the neural correlates of shame has found consistent activation of the amygdala during shame-relevant stimuli and shame-inducing scenarios. The amygdala, associated with the rapid detection and evaluation of threat, responds to social threat with the same urgency it brings to physical threat, because for a deeply social species, the threat of being found fundamentally unworthy of group membership is a genuine survival threat. Shame activates the threat detection system because the information being processed, "I may be too defective to be acceptable to the people I need," is processed by the nervous system as dangerous. The emotion is categorized not as a minor social discomfort, but as a potential catastrophe requiring immediate response. Research has found elevated activation of the anterior insula during shame experiences, a region associated with the processing of disgust and with interoceptive awareness of the body's internal states. At the neurological level, shame involves an element of self-directed disgust. The self becomes the object of the aversive response that the insula normally directs toward contaminated food, rotten material, and physical revulsion. The body turns an ancient protection mechanism inward. The self becomes the contaminated thing from which distance is desired, and the desire to hide, to remove the contaminated self from the social environment, mirrors the desire to spit out something rotten. The same neural machinery is activated. The target is different. Have you ever carried a version of yourself inside, certain that if it were truly seen, the people you love would turn away? The medial prefrontal cortex, the region most consistently associated with self-referential processing, with thinking about the self and comparing the self to social standards, shows pronounced activation during shame experiences. This activation reflects the self-focused nature of shame at the neural level. What is being processed is not the action in isolation, but the self as defined by the action, the self as evaluated by the imagined social gaze. The MPFC is the region the brain recruits when generating self-narrative, when holding the self as an object of reflection. In shame, this region applies the social standard to the entire self and returns a verdict of inadequacy that the rest of the brain then responds to as a genuine threat. Research comparing neural activation during shame and guilt has found that guilt more prominently engages the anterior cingulate cortex, the region associated with conflict monitoring, the detection of discrepancies between intended and actual outcomes, and the planning of corrective action. The anterior cingulate is the neural structure that registers, "Something went wrong here, and something should be done about it," which is precisely guilt's behavioral structure. Its relative prominence in guilt compared to shame is consistent with the behavioral difference. Guilt activates the system for identifying what went wrong and planning repair. Shame activates the system for evaluating the self and responding to threat. The default mode network, active during self-referential thought, internal narrative, and mind wandering, plays a specific role in shame proneness. Research has found that individuals high in shame proneness show elevated and distinctive default mode network activation, particularly in regions associated with self-evaluation and social cognition. When the mind of a shame-prone person is unoccupied, its default content is not neutral. It returns to self-critical, comparison-based, shame-generating material. The shame is not only an episodic response to specific triggering events. In shame-prone individuals, it becomes the baseline content of the resting mind. what the brain produces when no external task is directing its attention elsewhere. Shame activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and produces measurable cortisol responses. Research has found that social evaluation tasks, particularly those involving the possibility of being judged negatively by others, produce cortisol spikes, and that individuals with high shame proneness show larger and more sustained cortisol responses to these stressors than less shame-prone individuals. Chronic activation of the HPA axis across years of shame-prone responding produces cumulative physiological consequences: elevated baseline cortisol, progressive immune dysregulation, disrupted sleep architecture, and increased vulnerability to depression and cardiovascular disease. The body pays a long-term biological price for the chronic threat state that shame-proneness maintains. The evolutionary account of shame positions it as a social rank appeasement signal, a behavioral display that communicates submissiveness and deference in response to perceived social violation or status threat. Research on shame responses across cultures and in comparative ethology suggests that the shame posture is phylogenetically continuous with appeasement displays observed in other social species. It communicates to the social group that the individual acknowledges the transgression and poses no challenge to group cohesion. In ancestral environments, where group membership was a prerequisite for survival, a rapid, visible signal of this kind served a real social repair function. The system becomes pathological when it is chronically activated in response to ordinary human imperfection, in private, without any actual social audience available to receive and respond to the signal. Embarrassment and shame are regularly conflated, but research has consistently distinguished them. Embarrassment is transient, typically triggered by minor social violations or situations of temporary conspicuousness, and often carries an element of amusement that can eventually be shared with the people who witnessed it. Embarrassment does not contaminate the self-concept. Shame is deeper, more durable, and involves global negative self-evaluation. I am fundamentally lacking rather than that was awkward. The embarrassed person wishes the situation had not happened. The shamed person wishes they were a different person, or no person at all. The temporal span and the scope of self-implication differ fundamentally. The distinction between shame and humiliation is subtler but equally significant. In humiliation, the person believes the degrading treatment is unjust, that they do not deserve the negative evaluation they are receiving. Moral indignation is directed outward at the source of the degradation. In shame, the person agrees with the verdict. The self-assessment matches the evaluation being received or imagined. There is no moral indignation at the evaluating gaze, because the evaluating gaze is felt to be correct. This self-agreement is what makes shame so resistant to ordinary self-protective responses. The defenses that would normally counter a false accusation do not activate when the accusation feels accurate. Tangney's longitudinal research tracking shame-prone and guilt-prone individuals found that shame-proneness predicted higher rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress symptoms, substance dependence, suicidal ideation, and interpersonal aggression across time. Guilt proneness predicted higher empathy, more pro-social behavior, stronger motivation to repair harm, and better psychological adjustment overall. The same original transgression, the same moral failure in identical circumstances, produces different long-term consequences depending on whether the person evaluates it as something they did or something they are. The emotional register in which the self responds to its own failures is among the most consequential differences in human psychological experience. High shame proneness involves not only episodic shame responses to specific triggering events, but a chronic orientation of self-surveillance, a persistent low-level monitoring of the self against internalized social standards, scanning continuously for evidence of inadequacy. Research has found that shame-prone individuals show heightened vigilance to social evaluation cues, more rapid detection of perceived negative judgment in ambiguous feedback, and a greater tendency to interpret uncertain social information as confirmation of existing negative self-beliefs. The shame-prone person does not only respond to shame when it arrives, they are already looking for evidence that it should. Shame contains a structural paradox noted by researchers from Darwin to contemporary psychologists. It is an emotion designed evolutionarily to motivate the repair of social violations, to produce visible acknowledgement of wrongdoing so that the social group can restore acceptance. But shame most reliably produces the opposite of what it was designed to achieve: withdrawal from the very social connection that would allow repair, concealment of the very vulnerability that genuine connection would require, and isolation from the people whose understanding or forgiveness would dissolve the shame most effectively. The emotion designed to restore social belonging most consistently destroys the conditions under which belonging could be restored. The shame that was meant to repair became the very thing that prevented repair. It was not born this way, it was made. Shame is classified by researchers as a secondary or self-conscious emotion, a category distinct from primary emotions like fear, joy, or distress in that it requires a prior cognitive achievement, the capacity to represent the self as an object of evaluation. A person cannot feel ashamed without being able to view themselves from an outside perspective, to hold a mental image of the self and subject that image to comparison against a standard. Primary emotions are present from birth. Shame has to wait for the self to arrive. Research by Michael Lewis and colleagues established that self-conscious emotions, shame, embarrassment, guilt, and pride, emerge in the second year of life, tightly coupled to the development of self-recognition. Children who could recognize themselves in a mirror showed shame-like behavioral responses to failure situations: postural collapse, gaze aversion, self-touching, and disengagement. Children who had not yet achieved mirror self-recognition did not. The capacity to feel shame is not available until the mind has built a self to evaluate. The development of shame is, in this sense, inseparable from the development of identity. Lewis's research on children's responses to success and failure documented early divergence in shame and guilt. Children in failure situations showed two distinct patterns: Some collapsed into the behavioral signature of shame, self-directed attention, reduced persistence, disengagement. Others oriented toward the failed task and tried again. The behavioral signature of guilt's repair motivation. Critically, the guilt-like response was associated with task-focused attention, while the shame-like response was associated with performance-focused attention, the child attending to what the failure said about them rather than to what could be done about it. The divergence appeared early, was behaviorally distinct, and was associated with different developmental trajectories. Shame travels through language before it travels through experience. The role of parental response in shaping a child's shame versus guilt orientation has been extensively studied. Research has found that parents who respond to children's misbehavior with character-directed negative evaluation, "You're naughty," "What's wrong with you?" "You're so selfish," produce children with higher shame proneness and lower guilt proneness over time. Parents who respond with behavior-directed evaluation, "That was a hurtful thing to do," "That behavior is not acceptable," produce children with higher guilt proneness and lower shame proneness. The grammatical target of parental negative evaluation, the child as a person, or the child's action as a specific event, teaches the child which unit is the appropriate object of moral self-evaluation. The lesson is absorbed before the child has the language to examine it. Tangney's and subsequent longitudinal research found that the parental shaming versus inducing guilt distinction carries measurable long-term consequences extending well beyond childhood. Children raised in shame-emphasizing environments showed higher rates of depression, anxiety, and interpersonal difficulty as adults, lower empathy, more externalizing behaviors, and reduced capacity for the kind of transparent accountability that genuine moral functioning requires. Children raised in guilt-emphasizing environments showed higher empathy, more prosocial behavior, better mental health outcomes, and stronger motivation to repair harm. Two different ways of responding to the same childhood transgression, changing only the grammatical target of the response, shape the emotional infrastructure through which the adult will evaluate themselves for the rest of their life. Research using systematic reviews and meta-analyses has found consistent associations between insecure attachment styles and elevated shame proneness. Fearful and preoccupied attachment styles, both characterized by anxiety about relationship security and the fear that one is not fundamentally worthy of love, show the strongest positive correlations with shame proneness. Dismissing attachment shows a smaller but still significant positive association. Secure attachment shows a negative association with shame proneness. Individuals with secure attachment are buffered against chronic shame, apparently because they carry an internal working model in which imperfection does not threaten fundamental belonging. The attachment relationship provides the first, most fundamental answer to the question that shame asks, "Am I worthy of being kept?" And the answer that relationship gives shapes how the question feels for the rest of a life. Have you ever heard a critical voice in your head that sounded like someone else's and recognized, too late or too early, exactly whose trauma generates shame through multiple pathways that research has documented with increasing precision. The helplessness of the traumatic event violates implicit assumptions about the self's capacity for agency and competence, assumptions that normally operate invisibly, below conscious awareness because they have never been contradicted. Research has found that among trauma survivors, shame about the self's response during the event, "I froze, I didn't resist, I couldn't protect the people I loved," and shame about the event as evidence of personal deficiency. "This happened to me because something about me made it possible," are among the most prominent and most clinically significant responses. In many trauma cases, the shame is more debilitating than the fear. The fear is about what happened. The shame is about who the person is revealed to be by the fact that it happened. Research validating the ICD-11 complex PTSD diagnosis, drawing on Judith Herman's original framework, identifies shame as a core feature of the condition, not a secondary symptom, but one of its defining elements. Alongside emotional dysregulation, interpersonal difficulties, and persistently negative self-concept, research has found that trauma treatment focused solely on fear and avoidance while leaving shame unaddressed produces incomplete recovery in a substantial proportion of cases. The complex PTSD that emerges from prolonged, repeated interpersonal trauma, particularly in childhood, is organized not primarily around fear but around shame, a pervasive sense that the repeated harm is evidence of fundamental personal deficiency. Treating the trauma without treating the shame is treating the surface without touching the structure beneath it. Research on the aftermath of sexual abuse has consistently found that shame is among the most prominent emotional responses, more reliably present than anger, and in many populations more distressing than the intrusive memories that clinical frameworks have traditionally emphasized. The specific shame of sexual abuse involves several overlapping processes: the shame of violation itself, the shame of having been selected as a target, which survivors often unconsciously read as evidence of something that marked them as targetable, shame actively cultivated by many perpetrators as a primary tool for preventing disclosure, and the compound shame generated when disclosure occurs and is not met with the belief and care it required. Each layer reinforces the others. The shame does not arrive as a single response to a single event. It accumulates. Neglect generates a distinctive and often under-recognized form of shame, where abuse produces shame about what was done to the person. Neglect produces shame about the person's apparent irrelevance, a shame whose content is not "I am bad," but something closer to "I do not matter enough to warrant care." Research on the long-term emotional consequences of childhood neglect, which has historically received less clinical and research attention than abuse, finds that the primary affective legacy is frequently neither sadness nor fear, but shame, a pervasive sense of fundamental unimportance, of being constitutively less worthy of attention than other people. This neglect-based shame is particularly resistant to treatment because it is organized not around a specific event that can be processed and reattributed, but around an absence. the care that never came, which leaves no specific memory to work with, only a vacancy that has hardened into a belief about the self. Have you ever been generous and patient with someone else for a failure that you would have condemned yourself for without hesitation? The internal self-critical voice, the inner critic that generates ongoing commentary on performance, appearance, behavior, and worth, is, in its chronic clinical manifestations, a form of internalized shame. Research by Paul Gilbert and colleagues on self-criticism has found that the inner critic activates the same physiological and neural threat state as external threat, elevated cortisol, amygdala activation, and the maintenance of chronic defensive arousal. The critical internal voice is not simply a neutral, self-evaluation mechanism operating in the service of improvement. It is the shaming evaluation of significant early relationships, learned when the person had no capacity to challenge or contextualize it, now running from the inside. It speaks in the vocabulary and tone of the original shaming relationships, but it is experienced as one's own voice, as the truth about oneself, because it was internalized before the person had a sufficiently developed self to recognize it as coming from outside. Research has consistently found that maladaptive perfectionism, the combination of extremely high personal standards with harsh self-evaluation in response to any shortcoming, is driven by shame avoidance rather than by intrinsic commitment to quality. The maladaptive perfectionist is not primarily motivated by the desire to do things well. They are primarily motivated by the terror of the shame that any evidence of inadequacy will produce. The high standards function as a defensive perimeter. If I can achieve perfection, the shame cannot enter. Research has found that this form of perfectionism is associated with higher anxiety, lower subjective well-being, higher rates of procrastination and avoidance, and paradoxically, poorer long-term performance outcomes than achievement motivation that is not organized around shame avoidance. The defense consumes more energy than the threat it was built to prevent. Research on social comparison and shame has found that upward social comparison, comparing the self to those who are performing better, earning more, or living more successfully, produces sharply different emotional responses in shame-prone versus guilt-prone individuals. For guilt-prone individuals, the same comparison that activates a specific motivational response, I could work harder, I could develop that skill, tends to be processed behaviorally as information about a specific gap to address. For shame-prone individuals, the identical comparison activates global negative self-evaluation. Not I am behind on this dimension, but I am less than. The comparison information is the same. The emotional infrastructure that receives it determines whether it becomes motivation or wound. Cross-cultural research has found significant variation in the experience and function of shame across cultures, organized around different relationships between the individual and the group. In collectivist cultures, shame is more tightly linked to threats to family or group honor rather than individual character alone, is more prominently experienced as a public phenomenon and carries more explicit social and relational weight in regulating behavior. In individualist cultures, shame is more tightly linked to individual performance and character failure, and is more frequently experienced privately in the absence of any actual audience. The core features of the emotion appear across both cultural types. Its triggers, its scope, and the social mechanisms through which it operates differ substantially. Research on honor cultures. Social systems organized around the primacy of personal and family reputation has found that shame and its avoidance function as among the most powerful behavioral regulators capable of motivating actions that outsiders experience as disproportionate, but that are understood within the cultural framework as appropriate responses to the scale of what is at stake. Studies have found that honor culture orientation is associated with higher sensitivity to disrespect, faster and more intense shame responses, and higher rates of shame-associated aggression, responses in which the externalization of shame produces violence as an attempt to restore the self-concept that the shaming event threatened. Research distinguishes between what functions as adaptive shame, the brief, proportionate response to a genuine social violation that motivates visible acknowledgement and pro-social repair, and a pervasive, identity-level state of fundamental defectiveness that is not organized around any specific behavior and cannot be resolved by any action. The adaptive form is episodic, calibrated, and functional. The chronic form is a self-state, a persistent background condition of the self that colors all experience without being traceable to any specific event that could be addressed. Research has found that it is this chronic identity-level form, rather than episodic shame responses to specific transgressions, that is associated with the most significant clinical and relational consequences. Research by Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues on the neural basis of social exclusion found that the experience of social rejection activates neural regions associated with physical pain, including the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and right ventral prefrontal cortex, producing a subjective experience of pain that is qualitatively continuous with physical suffering. The social pain of exclusion and the shame of being found unworthy of inclusion draw on overlapping neural architecture. This overlap helps explain why shame responses to social rejection can feel as physically real and as urgent as responses to physical threat, because at the level of the neural systems processing them, the two events are treated as categorically similar. Research on social media use and emotional experience has found consistent associations between passive social media consumption, scrolling through others' curated presentations without active participation, and elevated social comparison, reduced self-esteem, and increased shame-adjacent states. The specific architecture of social media creates conditions that are remarkably well-suited to amplifying shame: quantified social validation, constant high-visibility upward comparison targets, and instant public exposure of perceived inadequacy. The shame system that evolution built for the small face-to-face communities of ancestral environments is now running in a social environment structured by algorithms specifically optimized to capture and hold attention, which it does, partly, by activating the very social evaluation anxiety that shame depends upon. Research has found that individuals with high moral perfectionism, those who hold extremely high standards for their own ethical behavior and evaluate themselves harshly when they fall short, show elevated shame sensitivity, higher rates of clinical depression, and paradoxically, lower rates of actual moral behavior over time compared to those with more flexible ethical self-standards. The shame generated by moral failure produces defensive self-concealment and self-protection rather than the transparent accountability and genuine reparative behavior that moral development requires. The moral perfectionism that claims to demand the highest ethical standards from the self ends up protecting the self-image at the expense of the moral functioning it claimed to serve. Research on family systems and emotional development has found that shame transmits across generations through multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously. Through parenting practices that emphasize character-based rather than behavior-based evaluation, through the modeling of shame-based self-evaluation by shame-prone parents who demonstrate rather than instruct, through the explicit verbal shaming of children, and through family-level shame narratives, the unspoken and spoken stories about what the family can never be, what it has failed to achieve, what must never be disclosed. Research has found that parental shame-proneness is a significant predictor of child shame-proneness, and that the intergenerational transmission operates through both behavioral and emotional modeling pathways. Shame does not need to be taught explicitly. It is absorbed from the emotional atmosphere of the earliest relationships. Before the child has the cognitive development to evaluate what they are learning, the voice that says, "You are not enough," learned those words somewhere. It did not arrive speaking them, and before the words, there was the body. Of all the self-conscious emotions, shame is among the most strongly embodied. Research comparing the physical experience of shame to other negative emotions has found that it is not primarily a cognitive event with accompanying physical sensations. It is experienced as a total body state with physical components that subjects consistently describe as among the most immediately salient features of the experience. The sensation of shame is often reported as arriving before the thought content of shame has fully assembled, as though the body receives and interprets the verdict before the mind has finished reading it. Shame is felt deeply and physically before it is understood. Research by Jessica Tracy and David Matsumoto, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008, studied the expression of pride and shame in sighted, blind, and congenitally blind judo athletes from over 30 nations at the Paralympic Games. The behavioral expression of shame, the head dropping forward and downward, the gaze averting, the shoulders rounding inward, the body making itself spatially smaller, was produced spontaneously and consistently by congenitally blind individuals who had never observed the display in others. Because these athletes could not have learned the posture by watching other people, the finding supports the conclusion that the shame display is not culturally learned behavior, but a biologically based, cross-culturally universal expression. Culture moderated the shame display among sighted athletes. It was more suppressed in individualistic, self-expressive cultures. But among congenitally blind athletes, the cultural moderation largely disappeared. The body knows the posture the moment the shame arrives. The shame posture does not merely express the shame state, it actively maintains and amplifies it through proprioceptive feedback. Research in embodied cognition has established that body position influences emotional state through multiple physiological channels, direct proprioceptive feedback to self-evaluation regions, alterations in hormone levels, and changes in the orientation of attentional focus. The collapsed posture of shame reduces self-efficacy perceptions, elevates cortisol, and narrows attentional focus towards self-directed negative content, maintaining the physiological and cognitive conditions that produced the shame response. The posture and the feeling are not in a one-way relationship. They are a mutually reinforcing circuit. Shame produces the posture, and the posture sustains the shame. Changing the body, research suggests, changes the feeling, not completely and not permanently, but measurably. The body is co-generating the state it appears only to express. The body of shame is not a passive record of what the mind decided. It is part of what the mind is deciding. The avoidance of eye contact in shame serves a specific social function whose evolutionary roots lie in the primate dominance hierarchy. In most social species, direct gaze is a signal of dominance and challenge. Gaze aversion signals submissiveness, deference, and the absence of competitive threat. The shame response's characteristic gaze aversion sends a precise appeasement signal to the social environment. This individual acknowledges the violation, poses no challenge, and is not contesting the social judgment being applied to them. Research has found that gaze aversion in shame situations reduces others' aggressive responses and facilitates the forgiveness responses that allow re-entry into social acceptance. The gaze goes down not because the person has lost confidence, though that loss is also real, but because the display was designed to go down, shaped by evolutionary selection for a signal that reduces social threat and communicates the willingness to be corrected. Blushing, the involuntary reddening of the face and neck in response to embarrassment or shame, is among the most distinctively human of all emotional expressions. No other animal blushes in response to social evaluation, and blushing is specifically resistant to voluntary suppression. It cannot be willed away, and the attempt to suppress it frequently intensifies it. Research on the social signaling function of blushing has found that the display serves a genuine reputational function in social interactions. Studies by Peter de Jong and colleagues found that people who blush following a social transgression or embarrassing situation are rated as more trustworthy, more pro-socially motivated, and more genuinely socially concerned than those who do not, even when the blushing person experiences the blush as mortifying. The involuntary nature of the blush is precisely what makes it informative. It cannot be faked or strategically deployed, and its presence therefore communicates authentic social concern with a credibility that deliberate expressions cannot achieve. The display that feels like exposure is simultaneously evidence of genuine care about the relationship. The visceral component of shame, the stomach dropping, the wave of nausea, the sensation of physical illness in the abdomen, reflects the involvement of the enteric nervous system and the gut-brain axis in the full-body mobilization of the shame response. The vagus nerve carries bidirectional signals between the gastrointestinal system and the brain, and the autonomic activation associated with shame produces genuine gastric disruption. Motility changes, blood flow redistribution, and the physical sensations that are described as nausea or as a sinking in the stomach. Research on the somatic experience of shame has found that gut sensations are among the most consistently reported physical features of the emotion and are frequently reported as arriving before the explicit cognitive recognition of shame, as though the stomach registered the pattern before the prefrontal cortex had finished its evaluation. The visceral shame sensation is not a metaphor for the psychological experience. It is the physiological event itself, mediated by the same autonomic system that orchestrates the entire threat response. The heat of shame, the sensation of warmth spreading through the skin, particularly across the face, neck, and chest, is produced by cutaneous vasodilation driven by sympathetic nervous system activation. Skin temperature in the facial and chest regions increases measurably during shame and embarrassment states, tracking the subjective reports of heat that subjects provide. The involuntary nature of this response, its complete independence from the person's will or preference, is both informationally rich and socially exposing in a specific way. The body broadcasts the shame state to the social environment regardless of the person's intention to conceal it. The person who wishes most urgently to hide their shame is announced by their own skin. Shame produces a characteristic physiological stress profile: elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, activation of the HPA axis with cortisol release, and elevated skin conductance that research has found to be larger and more prolonged than the profile produced by guilt in comparable situations. The cardiovascular and hormonal response to shame is not categorically different from the response to external physical threat. The body mobilizes in ways designed for survival-level danger, not merely social discomfort. This is why intense shame is physically exhausting. The body has been running a full threat response, and the recovery from that response requires the same time and metabolic resources that recovery from physical exertion requires. The person who feels wiped out after a shaming experience is experiencing the genuine physiological aftermath of a biological crisis. Shame is not a feeling about the self. For the nervous system, it is a crisis that involves the whole body. Research on Stephen Porges's polyvagal framework and its application to shame has found that intense shame frequently activates what Porges calls the dorsal vagal state, the immobilization and shutdown response associated with inescapable threat, when flight is impossible because the threat is internal, and when fight is impossible because the threatening object is oneself. the nervous system may default to the most ancient of its three regulatory states: shutdown. Research has documented that shame responses, particularly intense or chronic shame, involve the physiological and behavioral signature of the dorsal vagal freeze, reduced heart rate variability, decreased facial expressivity and vocal prosody, diminished motivation and behavioral engagement, and the characteristic experience of emotional deadening and heaviness. The person in intense shame is not simply embarrassed or uncomfortable. Their nervous system has classified the experience as inescapable threat and responded with the same shutdown mechanism evolved for situations where escape or resistance were genuinely impossible. Dissociation, the disconnection of conscious experience from the normal stream of perception and feeling, is a documented response to intense shame. Research has found significant correlations between shame proneness and dissociative tendencies, and has documented the clinical phenomenon of shame-induced depersonalization, a sudden detachment from the self-experience during or after an intensely shaming event, in which the person feels they are observing themselves from a distance, that the self is unreal, or that the body is not their own. This response can be understood within the polyvagal framework as the nervous system's attempt to protect the self from a threat that is too total and too immediate to be fully processed consciously, when the self cannot escape the shame and cannot fight back against it, leaving the self, vacating the experiential position that is under attack, offers a form of protection. The cost is the loss of the very connection to experience that recovery would require. The voice changes distinctively during shame. Research on vocal characteristics in emotional states has found that shame produces reductions in vocal volume and intensity, combined with a characteristic dropping in pitch and a quality of vocal constriction, a narrowing that produces the strained, quietened quality that observers identify as the sound of shame. The voice makes itself smaller in the same way the body does. The same appeasement signal that collapses posture, averts the gaze, and narrows the breathing also quiets the voice. The shamed individual reduces their social footprint across every available channel, simultaneously communicating through body, face, and sound that they are withdrawing from the space they would otherwise occupy. The voice is not separate from the shame. It is one of shame's primary instruments. Breathing is altered by shame in specific and measurable ways. The shame response is associated with reduced breathing depth, increased breath holding, and a pattern of respiratory inhibition that reflects the freeze component of the shame response. The held breath of shame mirrors the held breath of physical threat, a pattern that minimizes sensory output in the context of danger. In shame, the threat is social rather than physical, but the respiratory system responds with the same inhibition. The shallow, held breath of shame contributes to the physiological state of reduced arousal and shutdown that characterizes the freeze response, and through the bidirectional communication between respiratory patterns and vagal tone helps maintain that state. Every held breath, sustained, deepens the freeze. Shame reduces every signal simultaneously. the voice, the breath, the gaze, the space the body takes. It is a whole person withdrawal conducted below the level of deliberate choice. When a person observes someone else in shame, the same neural and physiological systems involved in the observer's own shame response are partially activated through embodied simulation. Research has found that observing shame in others activates insula and medial prefrontal regions in the observer, produces shifts in the observer's own autonomic state, and generates vicarious shame-like responses that are phenomenologically distinct from secondary embarrassment. The social contagion of shame, its capacity to produce shame-adjacent states in those who witness another's shame, reflects the deep social embedding of the emotion and the nervous system's use of internal simulation to understand the emotional states of others. Witnessing shame is not a neutral observation. It is a partial participation in the state being witnessed. Clinical approaches to shame treatment that focus exclusively on cognitive restructuring, identifying and revising the distorted thoughts associated with shame, have shown limited effectiveness for deep chronic shame across multiple research contexts. Research on somatic and body-based approaches to trauma and shame, including somatic experiencing (EMDR) with somatic tracking, body-based mindfulness, and compassion-focused therapy that specifically addresses the body, has found that incorporating bodily experience into shame treatment produces outcomes that cognitive work alone does not achieve. This reflects the embodied nature of shame, a state that was encoded in the body as well as in narrative, cannot be fully accessed or changed through narrative alone. The body that learned shame needs to be part of the work. Research in embodied cognition has found that inducing the body positions associated with shame, forward head flexion, downward gaze, inward shoulder rotation, produces increases in shame-related cognitions and elevated cortisol in participants who have not been given any shame-relevant information. The posture alone, in the absence of any social or cognitive context that would normally trigger shame, activates elements of the shame state. This suggests that the emotional memory of shame is stored in muscular patterns as well as in neural content, and that the pattern can be activated by the body position before the cognition that would explain it arrives. The body has learned shame as a somatic routine. Every time the routine is run, it builds the case for the next running of it. Research has found specific and consistent relationships between shame and eating behavior. Body shame, appearance-related shame, is among the strongest predictors of disordered eating, including binge eating, compensatory restriction, and the cyclical pattern of eating to soothe the distress of shame, followed by shame about the eating that was used for soothing. Research has found that binge eating disorder is specifically associated with shame rather than guilt as the dominant moral self-evaluation, and that shame-prone individuals are more likely to use eating as an emotion regulation strategy and more likely to experience shame as a consequence of that strategy. The food becomes simultaneously a vehicle for managing the shame and a reliable generator of the next episode of it. Shame-prone individuals show characteristic sleep disruption. Research has found elevated rates of insomnia, reduced sleep quality, and increased sleep onset latency in high shame-prone populations. The mechanism is partly direct: the ruminative content of shame, the replay of shame memories, the generation of anticipatory shame about future social situations, the endless recirculation of the shame narrative is specifically associated with the hyperarousal that prevents sleep onset. Shame-related intrusive cognitions are among the most common and most disruptive forms of pre-sleep mental activity. The shame that does not resolve during the day relocates to the threshold of sleep, where the absence of distraction makes it louder. Chronic shame, the persistent, low-level threat activation of a shame-prone orientation, produces measurable consequences for immune function over time. Research has found associations between high shame-proneness and elevated pro-inflammatory cytokines, reduced natural killer cell activity, and markers of accelerated cellular aging. The HPA axis dysregulation that accompanies chronic shame, chronically elevated cortisol producing the well-documented immunosuppressive effects of sustained cortisol exposure, provides the primary physiological mechanism. The body does not distinguish between chronic threat from external danger and chronic threat from the self's own evaluative system. Either way, the immune system pays the same long-term biological price: body shame. The shame attached to the physical appearance of the self is among the most prevalent forms of shame in contemporary Western populations and is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, disordered eating, reduced health-seeking behavior, impaired sexual functioning, and avoidance of medical care, including preventive screenings. Body shame involves applying the global, identity-level negative evaluation that characterizes shame to the physical self specifically. Not my body has this characteristic, but my body is unacceptable, and since my body is what I am unacceptable. The person does not have an imperfect body that can be evaluated separately from their worth as a person. In body shame, they are their body, and the body's perceived failure is the self's failure. The shame spiral is the self-amplifying cycle through which shame intensifies beyond and away from its triggering event. The initial shame response activates the postural collapse, which, through proprioceptive feedback, maintains the physiological shame state. The maintained physiological state amplifies self-critical cognition. The elevated self-criticism generates additional shame about the shame response itself, the shame of being shameable, of caring what others think, of falling apart. The additional shame deepens the physiological state, and the cycle continues, each revolution taking the person further from the specific triggering event and deeper into a global state of self-condemnation that has become structurally self-sustaining. Research has found that shame-prone individuals are significantly more susceptible to this spiraling process, and that once fully established, the spiral does not resolve spontaneously. The spiral does not end on its own. Understanding that is the first thing that gives it a limit. What shame does to the mind runs longer than any single episode. When the shame experience threatens to collapse the self entirely, when the exposure feels too total, the verdict too final, too devastating to be absorbed. The psyche sometimes converts the internal threat into anger as a way of externalizing and discharging what cannot be tolerated internally. Helen Lewis coined the term humiliated fury for this response, and June Tangney's research has extensively documented the shame-anger connection. Shame-prone individuals score significantly higher on measures of anger, hostility, and the desire to harm others in response to interpersonal threat. The anger does not resolve the shame. It covers it temporarily by redirecting the threatening evaluation outward, toward the person who triggered the shame or toward whoever is available. Narcissistic rage, the explosive, disproportionate anger that erupts in response to perceived criticism or disrespect, is the most clinically prominent form of this response, understood since Heinz Kohut's foundational work as essentially a shame management reaction dressed in the language of aggression. The rage announces, "How dare you?" while underneath it the shame is still running. It always is. The characteristic action tendency of shame is concealment, withdrawal from the social exposure that shame most fears. Research has documented a consistent pattern of shame-induced social hiding. The shamed person becomes less likely to disclose, less likely to seek help, less likely to maintain the social contacts that would allow recovery to begin. This hiding behavior compounds the problem it was developed to solve. Shame calls for the understanding and acceptance of others as its resolution. It is designed to be resolved through social reconnection, but is managed by removing the self from the very social context in which resolution would be possible. The hiding maintains the shame in the same way that avoidance maintains a phobia, by preventing the corrective experience that would update and eventually dissolve the threatening state. The person hides from the people who could help them. The shame grows in the absence of witnesses. Research has found consistently strong positive correlations between shame-proneness and depression, with multiple studies finding shame to be a stronger predictor of depressive symptoms than guilt. The mechanisms connecting the two are multiple and overlapping. The negative self-concept at the core of shame is structurally continuous with the cognitive content of depression. The social withdrawal that shame motivates removes the social connection that buffers against depression. The chronic cortisol elevation of shame-proneness produces the HPA dysregulation associated with depressive disorder, and the ruminative self-focus of shame is functionally identical to the depressive rumination that maintains and amplifies depressive states. Research has found the relationship to be bidirectional. Depression amplifies shame-prone processing, and shame-prone processing generates depression risk, creating a self-amplifying cycle that clinical intervention must address at both levels simultaneously to break. Shame and depression are not always separate conditions. For many people, shame is the depression, the verdict from which the low mood never quite recovers. Research has found significant associations between shame-proneness and multiple anxiety disorders, with the mechanism consistent across presentations. Social anxiety disorder shows the most direct theoretical connection. At its core, It is organized around the anticipation of shame, the persistent fear that the self will be found inadequate in social situations, exposed to negative judgment, and rejected by others, whose opinion has been elevated to the status of a verdict on the self. Research has found that shame-proneness is among the strongest psychological predictors of social anxiety severity, and that treating social anxiety without explicitly addressing the underlying shame-based self-evaluation that drives the anticipatory threat appraisal produces consistently inferior treatment outcomes. Generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder with intrusive thoughts, and health anxiety all show significant connections to shame-proneness. In each case, shame elevates the perceived threat of internal states and imagined external judgments in ways that amplify and maintain the anxiety. Research has established shame as a central feature in the development and maintenance of eating disorders across diagnostic categories. Body shame, the identity-level negative evaluation of the physical self, drives dietary restriction as an attempt to modify the body that is the source of the shame verdict. In anorexia nervosa, the shame attaches to eating itself. The food becomes contaminated by its association with the body's perceived excess. In bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, the binge occurs partly as a shame management strategy, a way of temporarily soothing the unbearable effect of body shame while simultaneously generating the intense shame about the loss of control and the eating behavior that then drives the compensatory behavior or the next episode. Research has found that shame maintains these disorders by providing both the motivation for the eating-related behavior and the self-evaluation that makes recovery feel pointless. Why would anyone make the effort to recover a self that is fundamentally unworthy of recovery? Research has documented a bidirectional and self-perpetuating relationship between shame and substance use disorders. Shame-prone individuals are significantly more likely to use substances as a strategy for managing the painful affect of chronic shame. Substances provide temporary relief from the self-directed threat that shame-proneness maintains as a background condition of daily experience. Substance use then generates additional shame about the using, about the behavior that occurs during intoxication, about the loss of control, about the damage to relationships, and the failure to meet the standards the person holds for themselves, which activates further substance use as the available management strategy. Research has found that shame is not only a risk factor for the development of substance use disorders, but a primary barrier to recovery. The shame of having become someone who does this is among the most consistently reported obstacles to the sustained behavioral change that recovery requires. The shame and the use maintain each other. Research has found significant associations between shame-proneness and non-suicidal self-injury, with shame identified as one of the primary emotional antecedents of self-harm behavior. Self-harm has been documented as a strategy for managing intolerable shame affect through two primary mechanisms. The first is self-punishment. The physical pain enacts invisible, concrete, and bounded, form the punishment that the shame verdict internally demands. It provides a specific physical form of the harm the person already believes they deserve. The second is displacement. The specific pain of self-harm provides a different and more manageable experience that temporarily displaces the boundless, undifferentiated pain of shame. The harm provides momentary relief from the shame. The shame of the harm generates the next episode. Shame does not only arrive. Once it is established, it generates its own reasons to continue. Research on suicidality has found that shame proneness is a stronger predictor of suicidal ideation and attempts in multiple populations than guilt proneness, a finding that is consistent with the fundamental theoretical distinction. Guilt provides a behavioral resolution. Acknowledge what was done, make amends, change the behavior. The distress of guilt contains its own structural exit. Shame provides none. When the self is the problem, not a specific behavior that can be changed, but the entire self constitutively and irreparably, the behavioral routes through which guilt's distress can be reduced are not available. Research on suicidality in trauma populations has found that the specific shame cognition, I am a burden to those I love, and I am fundamentally unworthy of belonging. Both shame-based self-evaluations rather than guilt-based behavioral assessments are among the strongest cognitive predictors of progression from suicidal ideation to action. For shame, unlike guilt, the elimination of the self can appear as the only solution that the problem formulation allows. Research has established that shame and pride are regulated by the same fundamental self-evaluation and social comparison system, not simply opposite ends of the same dimension, but dual outputs of the same underlying process. Both assess the self against standards and against others. Pride arises when the self exceeds the threshold, shame when it falls below. This shared architecture has a specific clinical implication. The person most susceptible to shame-based collapse is often the same person most powerfully drawn to grandiosity and pride-based self-inflation. The inflated self-concept provides a defense against the shame it is organized to prevent. But it is, by its structure, always one accurate social comparison away from collapse. Shame and narcissism are not opposites arranged at the far ends of a spectrum. They are the same systems, two extreme responses to the same underlying question about whether the self is enough. Research has found that maladaptive perfectionism functions as a defense against the shame that any evidence of inadequacy would produce, an attempt to build a structure so flawless that the shame cannot find an entrance. The failure of this defense is structural. Perfectionism sets the threshold for shame-triggering failure at a level that by definition cannot be stably achieved. Everything below perfect becomes evidence of inadequacy, and perfection, being constitutionally unavailable, means the defense cannot be maintained. The perfectionism that was built to prevent shame reliably guarantees it. Research has found this pattern associated with higher procrastination, higher anxiety, poorer sustained performance outcomes, and the characteristic rhythm of intense effort followed by avoidant collapse that represents the defense finally failing at a specific accumulated point of intolerable exposure. Research has found that shame-prone individuals are significantly more likely to lie to conceal personal transgressions than guilt-prone individuals. The mechanism runs directly from the theoretical distinction. Guilt motivates acknowledgement and repair, for which honesty is instrumentally necessary. Shame motivates concealment of the evidence that confirms the verdict the person has already accepted. The shame-prone person does not primarily lie to avoid external consequences. They lie to prevent the exposure of the self that truth would make available, to protect the self from being seen and confirmed as what shame has already decided it is. The lying is a protective reflex around the self-concept, not a strategic calculation about outcomes. Shame turns the mind inward and then builds walls to keep anyone from seeing what it found there. Social anxiety disorder is, at its structural core, a disorder of shame-related threat appraisal, the persistent, anticipatory fear that the self will be found inadequate in social situations, exposed to others' negative judgment, and rejected on the basis of what that exposure reveals. Research has found that shame-proneness is among the strongest psychological predictors of social anxiety severity, and that the cognitive content of social anxiety maps directly onto shame's threat appraisal. Anticipatory shame about performance, about appearance, about the impression one will make, about the internal states that might be visible. The behavioral avoidance that defines social anxiety disorder is shame's hiding response deployed in advance of any actual threatening situation. The person avoids the social context not to avoid discomfort in general, but to avoid the specific shame that social exposure reliably produces. Research has found that shame is among the most significant predictors of premature dropout from psychotherapy across therapeutic approaches. The therapeutic context creates conditions specifically activating for shame, disclosure of personal material, including failures and inadequacies that have been concealed from others for years, the inherent power differential of the therapeutic relationship, feedback that can be experienced as evaluation, and the inevitable imperfections of the therapeutic alliance. Disclosure is what shame most powerfully motivates against. The therapy requires what the shame forbids. Research has found that when therapists do not explicitly recognize and work with shame in the therapeutic process, standard interventions can inadvertently intensify it. The person stops attending. The discontinuation is experienced as one more evidence of the inadequacy that brought them to therapy in the first place. Research on intimate relationships has documented a destructive relational cycle organized around unacknowledged shame. One partner's experience of shame, triggered by a specific interaction, generates reactive anger or defensive withdrawal. The anger or withdrawal activates shame in the other partner. The other partner responds defensively, and the cycle escalates into conflict that appears to be about the presenting behavior, but is structurally organized around the shame beneath it. Research by Tangney and others has found that unacknowledged shame in both partners frequently drives the escalating conflict in distressed relationships. Conflict that resists resolution because neither party can tolerate acknowledging the shame that is actually generating their responses. The content of the argument keeps changing. The shame underneath it stays the same throughout. Shame is rarely created alone, but it is almost always carried alone. Research has found that shame transmits across generations through multiple simultaneous pathways. Direct verbal shaming is the most visible. Behavioral modeling of shame-based self-evaluation is more pervasive. The parent who responds to their own failures with global self-condemnation rather than specific self-correction teaches the child, without explicit instruction, which unit is the appropriate object of moral evaluation. Family-level shame narratives, the subjects that cannot be discussed, the failures that implicitly organize family silence, install shame without any direct interpersonal transaction. Research has found that a parent's unprocessed shame is one of the strongest predictors of shame proneness in the child. Operating through all of these pathways simultaneously before the child has any developmental capacity to understand what is being absorbed. Research has found that shame operates at the level of group identity as well as individual self-concept, producing collective shame in members of groups associated with historical atrocities, institutional failures, or persistent moral shortcomings. Research comparing collective shame and collective guilt has found the same fundamental parallel as at the individual level. Collective guilt motivates reparative action and constructive engagement with what was done. Collective shame motivates defensive denial, minimization, and attacks on those who raise the shame-generating subject. The group that processes its moral failures through shame is less likely to address them than the group that processes them through guilt. What is true for the individual is true for the community. Research on autobiographical memory has found that shame memories have characteristics that distinguish them from ordinary negative memories. They are experienced with unusual vividness and personal relevance, tend to be intrusive, arriving involuntarily and resisting suppression, and carry the full emotional intensity of the original event rather than the diminished charge that normally accompanies emotional memory across time. Shame memories do not undergo the ordinary emotional fading that eventually converts most negative memories from threats to information. The shame of something that happened 20 years ago can be recalled at an intensity not significantly different from the original event. The memory is kept young by the shame's continuing claim on the self. It is preserved by the verdict that has never been revised. Research has found that intrusive shame memories share characteristics with traumatic intrusive memories. They arrive involuntarily, resist deliberate suppression, and reliably increase in frequency when suppression is attempted. The strategies people spontaneously deploy to manage shame memories, suppression, distraction, deliberate avoidance of the shaming material, are precisely the strategies that research on unwanted thoughts has found to maintain and amplify intrusive content over time. Shame is perpetuated in significant part by the strategies developed to avoid experiencing it. The avoidance and the maintenance are the same system. Research by Paul Gilbert and colleagues has distinguished between externally referenced self-criticism. Others will judge me negatively, and internalized self-criticism. I am fundamentally inadequate. Both forms activate the threat response system, but the internalized form shows the strongest associations with severe clinical outcomes, including depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. This internalized self-critical voice operates like a hostile relationship with the self, generating the same physiological threat responses as being in a chronically threatening relationship with another person. Because at the level of the nervous system that processes it, it is one. The source of the threat is internal. The body responds to it as though it is everywhere. Research has found that shame is among the most powerful inhibitors of creative expression and intellectual risk-taking. Creativity requires the willingness to generate imperfect attempts, to be wrong in public, to expose unfinished thinking to the possibility of negative evaluation. Shame makes every imperfect attempt evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Every incomplete thing, every visible error, every exposed uncertainty becomes potential confirmation of the shame verdict. Research has found that shame-prone individuals show reduced creative risk-taking, more frequent self-censorship, greater reluctance to share unfinished work, and lower creative output despite no measured deficit in creative ability. The shame does not eliminate the capacity. It makes the person unable to bring the capacity to the surface, because bringing it to the surface requires accepting the risk of the verdict that bringing it might produce. The mind shaped by shame does not lack capacity. It lacks the safety to bring capacity to the surface. That safety is not accidental. It can be built. Shame is specifically resistant to the ordinary processes of self-improvement, cognitive restructuring, and behavioral change for reasons built into its own structure. Improving behavior does not address shame's core verdict, because shame's problem is not the behavior, it is the self and the strategies people naturally deploy to manage the pain of shame. Concealment, avoidance, social withdrawal, cognitive suppression are the same strategies that research has found to maintain and intensify shame over time. Shame is resistant to change, partly because the person carrying it is using, in good faith, the exact methods that prevent change from being possible. The management and the maintenance are the same system running in the same direction. Research, particularly Brené Brown's work on shame resilience, has consistently identified disclosure to an empathic other as shame's primary antidote, the most powerful single intervention for dissolving the shame state. Disclosure allows the shameful material to be received rather than concealed, processed rather than avoided, and held within another person's witness rather than carried alone. But shame most powerfully motivates against the very act that would relieve it, against the vulnerability of being seen in the material that the person is most certain would produce rejection. The exact thing that would dissolve the shame is the thing it most reliably prevents. The treatment requires what the condition forbids. This is the central structural problem of shame and the central structural problem of its treatment simultaneously. Brown's qualitative research on shame and vulnerability identified a set of capacities that distinguish people with what she called shame resilience. The ability to recognize shame when it occurs and move through it without losing one's sense of self. From those for whom shame produces lasting damage, the capacities she identified include the ability to recognize shame when it arrives rather than being unconsciously absorbed by it, the willingness to tolerate the vulnerability of disclosure to at least one trusted person, the development of critical awareness about the cultural messages and social standards that generate shame, and the maintenance of connections in which genuine disclosure is possible. Research has found that none of these capacities is fixed. All of them can be developed through practice and supported by therapeutic work. Shame resilience is not a trait some people have and others lack. It is a set of skills that can be learned. Kristen Neff's research program on self-compassion defined as extending to oneself the same kindness, understanding, and patience one would offer a close friend experiencing the same difficulty, has found consistent and large negative correlations between self-compassion and shame-proneness across multiple samples and measurement approaches. Highly self-compassionate individuals show lower shame-proneness, higher psychological well-being, stronger guilt-like reparative motivation when they have caused harm, and higher rates of post-traumatic growth following adversity. Research has found that structured self-compassion interventions produce measurable reductions in shame-proneness and depression that persist at follow-up. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence or the lowering of standards. Research has found that self-compassionate individuals hold themselves to equally high standards. They simply respond to falling short with the care-based processing of guilt rather than the threat-based collapse of shame. Mindfulness, the deliberate, non-judgmental attention to present moment experience, addresses shame through a specific mechanism, the capacity to observe the shame state rather than be identified with it. In the mindful stance, shame can be noticed as a mental and physical event without being automatically accepted as a true verdict about the self. Research has found that mindfulness practice is associated with reduced shame-proneness, reduced experiential avoidance of shame-related content, and reduced cognitive fusion with shame thoughts. The process by which a shame thought is treated as an accurate description of reality, rather than a thought arising in a mind that is capable of generating inaccurate descriptions. The mindful observer can say, "I am experiencing shame," rather than "I am the thing shame says I am." The grammatical distance is not merely semantic. It creates the space in which the verdict can be examined rather than simply inhabited. Between the shame and the self, mindfulness places a pause. The pause is where everything that follows becomes possible. Research by Brené Brown and independently by researchers studying social support and emotion regulation has found that the most powerful dissolvent of shame is empathy received from another person. Specifically, the experience of disclosing shame-related material and having it met not with judgment, advice, or minimization, but with genuine recognition. "Me too, that makes sense," You are not alone in this. Brown's finding that empathy creates a hostile environment for shame, that shame cannot survive being received with empathy in the same form it arrived, has been supported by research on shame disclosure and social support. Shame is a social emotion that was designed to be processed socially. When the processing occurs, when the disclosure is made and the response is empathic connection rather than the anticipated judgment, the structure maintaining the shame is interrupted. The shame does not necessarily vanish, but it loses the isolation it requires to remain at full intensity. Research on group therapy for shame-related conditions, social anxiety disorder, eating disorders, addiction recovery, complex trauma, has found group modalities specifically effective for shame reduction, producing outcomes that individual therapy alone does not consistently achieve. The therapeutic mechanism is specific. The experience of disclosing shame-related material to others who are themselves carrying shame and finding that the disclosure is received with recognition rather than rejection creates a directly corrective experience that addresses shame's core prediction. Research has found that the experience of universality, discovering that the material one believed was uniquely damning, is recognized by others as familiar, human, and bearable, is one of the most therapeutically active ingredients in group treatment. The person expected judgment and found belonging. That is not a cognitive reframe. It is a lived experience that shame cannot fully argue against. Several structured therapeutic approaches have been specifically developed or adapted to address shame as a primary clinical target. Compassion-focused therapy, developed by Paul Gilbert, directly targets the shame-based inner critic, replacing the threat-based self-evaluation that shame installs with a care-based alternative developed through systematic practice. Schema therapy addresses the early maladaptive schemas that organize shame-prone self-evaluation and have persisted from their developmental origins into adult life. EMDR has been found effective for processing shame-laden traumatic memories, reducing their emotional charge and diminishing their intrusive quality. Research on all three approaches finds significant reductions in shame proneness and associated clinical symptoms across treatment protocols. Evidence that the shame-based self-evaluation that feels permanent is not permanent. It is a learned orientation, and learned orientations can be changed. James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing, first published in 1986 and subsequently replicated across more than 400 studies, found that writing for short periods about emotionally significant experiences, including their thoughts and deepest feelings, produces measurable psychological and physiological benefits. The mechanism appears to involve the narrative organization of emotional material. Writing imposes a linguistic and sequential structure on experiences that were previously processed as unresolved, threatening, and undifferentiated, converting them from overwhelming emotional presence into a coherent story that can be held at a reflective distance. A meta-analysis of the expressive writing literature found an overall positive effect on psychological and physical health outcomes. For shame specifically, writing creates a context in which shame-generating material can be examined without the social exposure that shame most fears, a partial step toward the fuller processing that disclosure to another person can eventually complete. Genuine accountability, taking responsibility for specific harmful behavior and committing to address and repair its effects, is not the same as shame, and research has found that confusing them produces worse outcomes on every measure that matters. Genuine accountability is guilt-structured. It identifies a specific action, acknowledges its impact, experiences the discomfort of that acknowledgement, and orients toward repair. It does not implicate the entire self. It does not produce the desire to disappear. Research has found that accountability without shame, full, honest ownership of what was done, without treating that ownership as a verdict on fundamental worth, produces better actual repair of relationships, more genuine behavioral change, and higher long-term well-being than accountability conducted through shame, which typically generates defensive collapse and concealment rather than the transparent engagement repair requires. Accountability says, "I did this, and I will address it." Shame says, "I am this and I cannot." Research has found that guilt is a more effective motivator of prosocial behavior and genuine moral change than shame, a finding that inverts the intuitive assumption that the more severe the self-evaluative pain, the more effective the behavioral correction. The mechanism is consistent. Guilt preserves the self and isolates the behavior, leaving the self's agentic resources available to address what the behavior caused. Shame collapses the self, consuming precisely the psychological resources, the motivation, the confidence, the capacity for action that would be needed to make amends. A person in the grip of shame cannot effectively repair the harm that shame is about, because shame has occupied the space where the motivation and capacity to repair would have been. Guilt is built for repair. Shame is built for hiding. The moral emotion that feels more severe is the less effective instrument. Several clinical frameworks identify the shift from shame to guilt as a central therapeutic goal, the movement from "I am bad" to "I did something bad that I can address." Research on this shift has found that it does not eliminate the moral discomfort of the original transgression. It redirects that discomfort from the self's identity to the specific behavior where it becomes productive rather than paralyzing. The person does not feel better about what they did. They become able to do something about it rather than simply suffering the verdict of having done it. Research on self-forgiveness has distinguished it carefully from self-exculpation, minimizing or denying what was done, and from prolonged self-condemnation, maintaining shame indefinitely. Genuine self-forgiveness involves full acknowledgement of the harmful behavior, appropriate accountability for it, and then the deliberate choice to release the self from continued self-punishment that has ceased to serve any reparative function. Research has found self-forgiveness associated with better psychological outcomes, stronger ongoing motivation for behavioral improvement, and better relational outcomes than either denial or continued shame. The person who forgives themselves is not excusing the behavior. They are releasing the self from a condemnation that no longer serves anyone, least of all the people the harm affected. Research across social psychology, clinical psychology, developmental neuroscience, and attachment theory converges on the same finding. The most powerful antidote to shame is genuine social connection, experienced belonging, received empathy, and the relational safety in which shame-generating material can be shared and received without the anticipated rejection. Shame is a social emotion designed to be processed in a social context. When that processing occurs, when the material is shared and the response is connection rather than judgment, the physiological threat state that shame maintains begins to regulate. Research by Brené Brown, by Naomi Eisenberger on social pain, and by John Cacioppo on the health consequences of loneliness all arrive at the same conclusion. The person who can share their shame is not the person who has solved it. They are the person who has found the way through it. Research has found a reliable positive correlation between shame and secrecy. The more shame a person carries about a specific aspect of themselves, the more likely they are to keep it concealed. And the more it is kept concealed, the more shame it accumulates. Secrecy deprives the shame material of the corrective processing that would update the threatening self-evaluation and reduce its intensity over time. It maintains the shame in its most potent and least examinable form, unwitnessed, unchallenged, growing in the absence of any human response that might differ from the one shame has already predicted. Shame grows in concealment and shrinks in connection. Research has documented this consistently across populations and topic areas. It is one of the most reliable findings in the empirical literature on this emotion. Research on stigma and social norms has found that cultural change in what triggers collective shame, the gradual destigmatization of mental illness, trauma, addiction, and other previously shame-generating human experiences, produces measurable population-level reductions in the shame individuals carry, independent of changes in individual psychology. When a domain of experience is progressively framed as human rather than shameful, when the collective message shifts from judgment to recognition, the shame attached to that domain reduces across the population it affects. The individual psychology of shame is shaped by and embedded in the collective standards against which it measures itself. Change the standard, and the shame changes with it. Research on growth mindset has found a consistent pattern. Treating failure as information about strategy produces better learning outcomes, more resilience, and less avoidance. Treating it as evidence of character produces shame and withdrawal. The distinction is not merely motivational. It is the difference between a mind that can update and a mind that has been stopped by the verdict. Failure is always information. The only question is which category the mind files it in, the category that can be worked with, or the category that cannot be recovered from. Shame is not purely pathological. It is also a signal. What a person feels most ashamed of maps the contours of what they most care about. The content of the shame is the content of the values. The person ashamed of having hurt someone they love cares deeply about not hurting people, The person ashamed of having lied cares about honesty, learning to read the content carefully. Rather than simply being overwhelmed by the verdict, turns the most painful internal experience into a source of self-knowledge. The shame examined is pointing at something worth protecting. It just does not know how to say so. Research on self-worth and psychological resilience has found that beliefs in unconditional human dignity, in worth that does not depend on performance, achievement, or the absence of failure, are stronger predictors of well-being than self-esteem contingent on external evaluation. Shame operates on conditional worth. It says you are acceptable only if you meet the standard. Dignity holds a different position. The worth was there before the standard was applied. It was there before the evaluation arrived. It does not depend on the outcome. It never did. Shame can challenge dignity, can make the statement of unconditional worth feel fraudulent, hollow, impossible to believe. But it cannot disprove it. The belief does not require the absence of shame. It survives alongside it. There is a moment that shame researchers and therapists describe across populations, across treatment approaches, with a consistency that goes beyond any single study. It is the moment when a person shares the thing they were most certain would make them unacceptable. Not the polished version, not the explained version. The thing itself, and the person receiving it does not pull away, does not judge, does not offer the verdict that shame had been promising was coming. They simply stay, and in that staying, something in the person who shared it changes. The shame goes quiet, not gone, quiet. The self discovers it was wrong about the most important thing it believed about itself. The difference between what you did and what you are is the space in which a person can be known. When someone enters that space without a verdict, shame loses the argument it has been making for years. This is what healing looks like, not a revelation arrived at alone, not a realization produced by reasoning, but someone staying. If this stayed with you tonight, please like and subscribe.